Rory Stewart, welcome to Acting Prime Minister, and thanks so much for joining us from the US, where I think you've been busy celebrating Thanksgiving this week.
I have indeed. Just a giant turkey lying all over the kitchen.
Yeah, I hope we're not interrupting turkey leftovers or anything this morning.
There's a lot of turkey leftovers going on. Turkey soup, turkey sandwiches, you can't believe it.
How are you finding it? Are you missing British politics out there in America? Because, of course, you're over there because you're a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute at Yale University now. But do you miss Westminster?
I feel it's a real relief, to be honest, to have a chance to step back and think and teach students and take a break. I mean, politics in Britain is, as you can imagine, I mean, as you probably know better than anyone, is an astonishingly intense, stressful, and unpleasant experience most of the time. And because most of us don't like politicians very much, we don't give them very much sympathy, but it is a very, very strange way of living your life. I think the fame bit is very odd. I mean, I found it very odd once I got to a stage when I was better known. Being stopped in the street by people is very strange, but it's also just the very unhealthy rhythm of your day that you're on a Monday night voting in Parliament till 10:30, and many evenings you're traveling up and down the country talking, so you don't see much of your family. So this is a real relief. I mean, it's given me, I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, so it's been a real relief.
Well, look, you did have a pretty good crack at becoming Prime Minister, and I'm sure you know the format of this podcast is that we're going to make you Prime Minister for the next half an hour. We're going to put you in Downing Street and pretend that you are Prime Minister. So we like to get everyone settled into number 10. First things first, what is the personal item that you would take from home into number 10 with you, do you think?
Oh, I think I'd probably take my grandfather's desk. I'd like the idea of having my grandfather's hands, my father's hands on the leather of that desk, slightly stained, battered desk. So I'd have a feeling that they were with me when I was doing my work.
Okay, and when you're sitting at that desk and you're going through your red box, what is the drink that you would pour yourself at night to keep you going?
I think I'd probably go really mad. I'd probably, if I was Prime Minister, I'd probably drink pudding wine. I'd drink sweet pudding wine.
Dessert wine?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right. We haven't had that one before. And who's the first person that you'd call?
To tell them I was Prime Minister or to come in and work? So first people I'd call, realistically, probably be my wife and my mother. But the second person I'd call would be whoever I wanted to make my chief of staff so that we could sit down and really think how we were going to run this government. Any
ideas who that would be?
I've got a couple of ideas, but I wouldn't want to embarrass them. But they're not people in politics. One of them is somebody who was very successfully ran a company who I've known for many years. And the other was one of my principal private secretaries when I was a minister, who I thought ran an amazing ministerial office, who I would have thought would be ideal for that. But the main thing is they should be a doer. What annoys me about chiefs of staff is that often when I've been in politics, they have seen themselves largely in terms of stopping risk and often managing communications. But I think a chief of staff, above all, is somebody to run the machine. You want somebody who really wants to get on with things, who's deeply interested in getting stuff done. So that when I was a minister, I was often frustrated. I'd go in to see Ed Llewellyn, or I'd go in to see Gavin Barwell, I'd go and see others. I'd be passionate to talk about my department. I'd want to say, this is what we want to do on the plastic bag tax, or this is how we want to clean up prisons. And I'd realized they weren't very interested, because in fact, what they were trying to do is basically defend the Prime Minister against risk and against attack. I'd want to turn that around. I'd want to have a chief of staff who really want to get their teeth into things.
Okay, let's talk about your path to power now. You were born in Hong Kong. Your father was a diplomat. You attended Eton and then Oxford before graduating to become a diplomat yourself, working in all sorts of interesting places. You took a couple of years out to walk across the Middle East and Asia, writing a book about your experiences, which was hugely successful. Then you returned to serve, amongst other things, as Deputy Governor in Iraq, before being elected in 2010 as MP for Penrith and the Border, which is where I first met you, covering ITV Border television. You went on to serve in 5 ministerial posts in government, including International Development Secretary, before running for the leadership after Theresa May stood down. Then you left Cabinet when Boris Johnson took over, resigning from politics altogether last summer. or last autumn rather. So quite an eventful career. I mean, you've been described as a diplomat, an author, a politician, now an academic. Where's your heart though? What would you say you are?
What I say is I'm somebody who loves getting things done. What I enjoy about government is bringing change. The ministerial job that I loved most was being prisons minister, because I came into a situation where there was a very, very big crisis. Violence had tripled in prisons. There was drugs everywhere. They were very, very dirty. And I felt it was something I could do. It was something I could make a difference to. And I had an idea on how to do that. And there's nothing, I think, in life that you can really find which is like that. It's a great, great privilege being in government, because you have, in these rare moments, real opportunities to change things. But the problem, of course, is that 90% of the time you often feel very powerless. It's very complicated to explain why, but many, many ministerial portfolios, a lot of what you're doing, it feels very difficult to get stuff done. All those jokes and yes, minister are true. The system is often trying to prevent you from doing stuff, but just occasionally, and I found that only in that prison minister's job, I really had a chance to get stuff done.
I mean, going to Eton and going to Oxford, did you feel a pressure to succeed? You say you like getting things done. Is that partly because you feel you need to sort of live up to the amazing education that you've had?
Yes, that's definitely true. And I was always somebody who never was very interested in making money. My father decided, strangely, that he thought I was going to be a priest. He thought I was going to be a bishop or something. Very ambitious for me. Didn't just want me to be a priest, wanted me to be a bishop. But definitely when I was at university, I was never interested in becoming a banker or management consultant or these things which a lot of people who were at university with me went to do. I wanted to be in public service. When I was young, I wanted to be a soldier, and then I wanted to be in the foreign service, be a diplomat. And I was very lucky to have these jobs in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were incredibly testing, exciting, fulfilling. Doing things that I could never have done if I hadn't been lucky enough to be in government.
And you walked for almost 2 years across Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, India, Nepal, staying in random people's homes. It's quite an unusual thing to do. Would you describe yourself as a bit of an eccentric?
I suppose so, yeah. I suppose so. I mean, I think, each one of us is a deeply individual person. I think one of the lessons of being a politician, because you're going around knocking on people's doors, you're meeting people all the time, is you suddenly realize how eccentric all of us are. I mean, some of us play it out in different ways, but one of the oddities is that I naively, when I began as a politician, thought that you could sort of work out what people in Cumbria thought. And of course, the truth is, there were in fact 500,000 different people in Cumbria thinking 500,000 different things. and actually Britain is about 70 million people thinking different things. So yes, I'm eccentric, but I think we're all very eccentric, and perhaps the British are more eccentric than almost any other nation on earth.
I mean, your eccentricity was sort of part of your appeal, I think, when you ran to become Tory leader, and you did quite well, particularly on social media. Were you surprised at how well you did do and how much momentum you had in the early part of the campaign?
Well, I'm very lucky. I mean, you're right. I mean, I came from nowhere, and I started with very little support, and suddenly found myself in the betting odds, going from being an outsider to being second favourite to Boris Johnson. And in fact, even in the opinion polls, I was second favourite to Boris Johnson again. But of course, the truth of the matter is always a long way behind Boris Johnson, even when I was second to him, because he was the out-and-out favourite in that race from the beginning. And one of the challenges that I faced is that I was very, very strongly against a no-deal Brexit. I thought that was a very bad idea. It wasn't that I was against Brexit. I accepted the referendum had happened, but I wanted what I suppose people would call a soft Brexit. I wanted a compromise, a kind of customs union type deal, where I hoped that we could bring the country together. And maybe the lesson for me from that was that message of arguing for the middle ground and compromise and bringing people together is popular with some people, and that's probably why I did reasonably well in the leadership campaign. But in the end, is probably not the way to win a Tory leadership contest.
Do you think it would be very difficult for the next Tory leader then to win on that middle ground? Because previous leaders have done. I mean, David Cameron was pretty centrist, right? So, but do you think those days are over then, that the next Tory leader will again come from, I don't know, what would you call it, the Brexity wing of the party rather than the One Nation wing?
Yes. I mean, I think British politics has changed. So for most of my life, British politics, if you took people's views, was a bit like a bell curve. All the votes were in the centre of a graph like that. And now the whole thing's collapsed like a blancmange. The votes seem to be on the extremes, and there doesn't seem to be much left in the centre. The one nation tradition of the Conservative Party was almost wiped out, really. Almost everybody who supported me in the leadership was from the One Nation wing of the Conservative Party. And most of the people who supported me in leadership were either thrown out of Parliament or resigned. So we ended up in a situation where if I was still in Parliament and running again for the leadership, none of those people who were supporting me, some of whom were in Theresa May's cabinet, would be around anymore. Instead of which, they've largely been replaced by people who have a very, very different view of the world. And somebody like me is very interesting. I mean, in the space of about a year, I suddenly feel like a very old-fashioned figure in the Conservative Party. People sort of look at me as though I'm some sort of relic of a kind of moderate, centrist, almost sort of 19th century view of the Conservative Party. It's very odd. And I find this when I come up against my former colleagues. So things that I took for granted. I mean, obviously, as a One Nation Conservative, it was important to me to have an independent Department for International Development, to spend our 0.7% on helping the world's poorest. It was important for me to have a Department for the Union to really work on keeping Scotland in the United Kingdom. It was deeply important for me to try to have a moderate, thoughtful Brexit that kept us very close to the European Union. So maybe politically separate, but economically very close. All those ideas now seem very unfashionable. Even, finally, oddly, being a One Nation Conservative was about being fiscally conservative, about being cautious about how much money you spend. So we would generally, it depends whether you talk about David Cameron or, my friend David Gauke or Nicholas Soames or Ken Clarke or these kind of people who were part of my support network, would have thought about themselves as people who were cautious with spending money. That's what made them conservatives, but who otherwise socially really felt that they could lean into the centre ground of politics.
Is this partly why you pulled out of the mayoral race? Because you were running as an independent candidate for next year's mayoral elections, which were supposed to be this year. I mean, you said it was because of the pandemic and you couldn't sustain your campaign for that length of time. But was there also maybe a sense that you felt that there wasn't space in the middle ground? Not that that race is particularly polarised, actually. Neither Sadiq Khan nor Sean Bailey for the Conservatives are particularly polarising characters. But did you feel as if maybe there wasn't an appetite for a sort of centrist type character?
Well, I think what I discovered in the polls is that I was able to run at that stage a close third, so I could get up to about 17% in the polls. But the key is that to win the London mayoral race, you'd have to get at least into second place in the first round in order to win in the second round. And oddly, party loyalty is very strong. So even though on an individual level, I was much better known, for example, than the Conservative candidate, Sean Bailey, in the end, people would vote Conservative, even if they didn't know necessarily who Sean Bailey was. It's very difficult to run purely as an independent. And that's, I suppose, I mean, at the time, of course, I saw that as a frustrating weakness in the British system. But you could say that was the strength of the British system too. I mean, parties are not, in and of themselves, always bad things. There are good things about parties. There are reasons why it makes sense to get people together in teams. There are reasons why British politics tends to be a bit suspicious of individuals trying to run on their own.
Okay, well, look, forget the mayoralty now because you're Prime Minister, don't forget, during this podcast. And let's talk about some of the big issues on your desk. Firstly, I'd love to talk to you about foreign aid because, of course, you were International Development Secretary. Would you have allowed your Chancellor to cut foreign aid from 0.7% to 0.5% of national income?
No, it's a terrible thing to do for two main reasons. Firstly, that the Conservative Party promised in its manifesto that it wouldn't do this, and the Prime Minister promised repeatedly that he wouldn't do this. So you've got to keep your promises. And the second thing is that the whole point about Brexit, for those who supported it, was always supposed to be that Britain was going to play a more influential role on the international stage. And it sends a very, very bad signal at the time that you're leaving the European Union to reduce the amount of money you have overseas. We already have a very weak foreign service. We spend about half what the French do on our diplomats. If you reduce our international development aid, it completely undercuts our ability, for example, to do international environment and climate stuff. And that's going to be very important because we're hosting the big climate conference in January. So no, that was a bad decision. I would have stopped that.
The government justifies it by saying that, we have to spend money on domestic priorities during a pandemic, there's no money left, etc., etc. What do you think were the real motivations behind cutting it, though? Because some people say it was red meat for the backbenchers.
Yeah, I mean, so the government has cut about £4 billion from international aid, but they are spending an extra nearly 300 billion worth of borrowing. So they are massively increasing spending on many other things. In fact, they've increased spending on defense at the same time as they're cutting the foreign aid spending. So it's not that they are trying to cut spending. This is a government that's spending an incredible amount of money on everything except international development. There's only one way to read this, which is that they basically don't like doing that kind of thing. And it's something that appeals deeply to the right of the party, always has. That's why when Boris Johnson was pitching himself to the One Nation, the centrist group of the Conservative Party, he kept promising that he would never cut foreign aid because people suspected that he would be tempted to do this to appeal to the right of the party.
Do you feel lied to then? He told you he wasn't going to cut it, and now he has.
Well, repeatedly I do. I mean, he won the election against me. And when I was running in leadership, I kept challenging him on things. I'd say things like, will you commit to not prorogue Parliament? Right? I spotted this in May, June. I said, you're never going to be able to get this through Parliaments. So will you commit to not prorogue Parliament? And yeah, he committed. He said, he's not the kind of guy who was going to prorogue Parliament. He wouldn't prorogue Parliament. He said that he wasn't going to abolish the Department of International Development. He said he wasn't going to drop the 0.7%. He now says it's temporary. Well, of course it's not temporary. He's never going to spend more on international development. It's inconceivable. He's not going to return it back up 0.7%. So this is, and again, I would say to him at the time, you can't leave by the 31st of October, obviously, because you don't have a majority in Parliament that's going to allow you to do that. Right? And he'd say, no, I'm going to do this. So the style of politics is a very odd one. And I found this when I was debating the Prime Minister in the leadership debates on television. I would say, but how are you going to do this? And the extraordinary thing is that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has found out that in modern politics, he doesn't really need to answer the question how. He just needs to assert that he's going to do it. And it doesn't do me any good to be proven right, because time moves on.
Yeah, you're out of that. You're out of that sphere now. And you wrote recently that you felt that Boris Johnson was the most accomplished liar in public life. What do you mean by that? I guess it's kind of obvious what you meant by that, but do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think he's somebody who, for a whole series of reasons, isn't very worried about whether what he says he's going to do, he's actually going to do. On the spur of the moment, when he's in a spot, he will say whatever is convenient at that moment, whatever's going to help him win votes. Sometimes he just doesn't tell the truth because he just likes making people happy. So a lot of the time when I was working with him in the Foreign Office, I was the Minister of State, he was the Foreign Secretary. A lot of the time he'd just say what he did because he didn't want confrontations. He wanted to just let people leave the room happy. But he doesn't mind letting people down. In fact, in some ways, he's got through life for more than 50 years by doing that again and again and never really getting in trouble for it. He's got caught out repeatedly. I mean, that's one of the interesting things. It's not that nobody's ever spotted this about him. But so if you ask me, if I'm acting Prime Minister for your podcast, I would try to find a more central role for truth in British politics. I think it's very important. I think it's important because the key to democracy is that the people can only vote for you on your manifestos. They have to believe that you're going to do what you said you're going to do. Otherwise, you make a nonsense of the democracy. They voted for one thing, they're not getting it. So the contract has to be that people can rely on your word. And the second thing I do, which I think we're not doing, is be serious. I think British politics is not serious. We need to focus on running things well, getting things done. The frustration from my point of view is that, of course, people during the leadership campaign focused on the fact that I am eccentric. And of course, in many ways, I'm eccentric. But what they didn't focus on is my ability to get things done, my track record in managing and delivering, whether in Iraq or in prisons. Something about British politics doesn't focus on seriously getting things done. It's become a sort of celebrity cult.
I suppose that's the question, is whether people care about that seriousness anymore, and also whether they care about truth. I mean, you're sitting there in America where you've got a sitting president claiming that he won the election, and millions, in fact, of loyal supporters believing that. I mean, do people care about truth? Do the people seek truth in politics anymore? Or do they just want to hear what they want to hear?
Well, you're completely right. And Donald Trump got second most votes for any president in world history in the last election, got 7 million more votes than he did the time before. And what Donald Trump's discovered, and to a lesser extent, Boris Johnson's nowhere near as bad as Donald Trump, obviously, but what they have in common with the governments in Hungary and Poland and populists all over the world is that they've realized that you don't need to campaign with serious, detailed statements about policy, that people will vote for you really from gut emotion, and they don't care very much what you say. But that matters. I mean, the reason this is a problem is on things like COVID management. And one of the things these governments are very, very bad at is managing things like COVID. And ironically, the less flashy governments, the much more old-fashioned centrist governments, Angela Merkel in Germany, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, are much, much better at getting around the details of these things. And that's because their political style is about seriousness and detail. The problem for the Boris Johnsons or Donald Trumps in dealing with something like COVID is they're frankly not used to taking an interest in that kind of detailed argument with experts.
And talking of the pandemic, you did call very, very early on for a lockdown. I think it was about March the 9th. You must have been one of the first people actually to call for...
Actually, I'm on record 22nd February.
22nd of February, right, even earlier than I had in my notes. So do you think that Boris Johnson is ultimately responsible for tens of thousands of deaths? Because the UK has one of the highest death rates in the world, and he didn't lock down when you called for him to lock down.
Well, I certainly felt that was a catastrophic error. And when I was calling at the end of February for this, it wasn't rocket science. It was already obvious, remember then, what was already happening in Italy. We could see the steps that China had taken. We could see the steps that South Korea had taken. We could see the steps that Taiwan could take. So firstly, we should have asked ourselves, why are all these other countries doing this stuff and we're not? Why are we letting flights come in from Milan without checking and quarantining people when other people are quarantining? And secondly, we should have really challenged this idea that he was exploring in February, this idea that you can somehow take it on the chin, right? These ideas that were coming from the chief scientific officer and chief medical officer that it wasn't possible or desirable, in their words, to curb this disease. These were bad ideas, and what you needed was somebody to tie, as it were, a wet towel around their head, sit around that Cobra table for hours, going through the details and asking, why are we doing this? Why are we not doing this? And gripping it. I mean, the great lesson that I learned as flooding minister was the same lesson that I learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. In a crisis, move quickly, no regrets, do stuff straight away. And generally, that means that you don't have to do so much later. Shut down quickly, you can open up the economy more quickly. Look at China, right? China basically has no COVID now, and its economy has barely been touched, right? It's growing at the rate that it was last year. Whereas Britain is going through the worst recession it's been in 300 years, and it's got a bad death rate.
I mean, this pandemic is now completely dogging the Prime Minister's premiership. It's amazing how quickly the course of his premiership has changed, in fact, in the space of a year. Do you think he will be able to last until the next election? Because there's a lot of discontent on the backbenches.
I don't know. I mean, the Conservative Party is a very ruthless thing. Remember, it took out Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister, took out Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. So it is a pretty ruthless thing. I mean, he has enormous advantages as a public communicator. Many people will think that he's an amazing campaigner. He's good at winning elections. But I do think that what defeated Donald Trump in the end was COVID. What always defeats populists is their inability to manage seriously, to take an interest in the details in a crisis. And if Boris Johnson ends up in a difficult situation, if he ends up being toppled, it will be because of this. It'll be because this is exactly the kind of issue that is his greatest weakness. He's fine presiding over the Olympics. You know, he's good when things are optimistic and happy, and he can make optimistic and happy statements to encourage people. What he doesn't like is difficult, detailed, bad news.
Do you think Rishi Sunak might be the next Prime Minister?
Well, he's certainly in a very strong position. I mean, he's a very impressive performer. He's very smart. I think he symbolizes a lot that people are proud of in the Conservative Party. But remember, politics is as you know much more than me, it's a very odd thing. So you can't really judge when somebody's the chancellor how good they would be at campaigning in an election, how good they are at communicating. I mean, we all have strengths and weaknesses, right? So somebody like Michael Gove is famously very, very focused on detail, very good at running departments, very interested in changing the detail of how stuff is done. Other people like Boris Johnson are great showmen, great, very, very funny communicators. And we don't quite know where Rishi Sunak sits on this, but definitely at the moment, you're right, he's in a very strong position.
I suppose the question is whether you think there's enough impatience in the party. I appreciate you're in America, but with all your experience of the Conservative Party and being an MP running for the leadership yourself, do you think there is enough patience for Boris Johnson for him to survive the next 3 years and lead the party into the next election? Or do you think he's lost so much capital?
Absolutely critical to him will be the next great challenge he faces, which is Brexit. Remember, his core support base was always around getting Brexit done. And it is the right wing of the party, the sort of ERG faction, that he cannot afford to lose. If he loses those people, if they decide that he's signed a Brexit deal which doesn't respect sovereignty, for example, he's really toast, because they brought him in purely because they thought he was the person who could do that. If he doesn't get that right, and that's a reason to be worried. I mean, if you're like me and you're worried about a no-deal Brexit, one of the reasons I'm very worried is that he will be very tempted to do a much harder Brexit than he needs to try to keep those people on side, because his political position is weak.
And of course, that poses a question for the union, and that was the next thing to ask on my list of questions for you as Prime Minister. And I know you're very passionate about the union. Nicola Sturgeon said in an interview over in the UK yesterday that she wants an independence referendum in the first part of the next Scottish Parliament. Would you grant her that referendum if you were Prime Minister?
It's very difficult to say no if Nicola Sturgeon won a very big majority in the Scottish Parliament and she campaigned on a mandate of a referendum, and the Scottish people voted and delivered a majority in Parliament for a referendum. It would be very difficult to say no, but it would break my heart. I mean, I think very sadly, having really thrown myself into that campaign, I mean, I'm half Scottish and half English, and my whole world is the United Kingdom. I wouldn't know where to go if Scotland went independent. I wouldn't know whether to move to Edinburgh or London. But I think it would be difficult to say no. And you asked me, what I would do as acting Prime Minister. What I committed to do in the leadership was to immediately set up a large Department of State for the Union, whose job would be to make sure that people in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland really understood what they got from being in the United Kingdom, what infrastructure they got, what support they got, what the advantages were of the thing. We're very bad at allowing people in Scotland to see how being in the United Kingdom helps. We're allowing the Scottish government to take the credit for everything and the London government to take the blame for everything. That's very bad politics.
I don't know if you saw today, there's a bit of a story in the UK that's caused a stir about putting a Union Jack flag on every vial of the Oxford vaccine. Maybe that's a way to save the Union. I think the government is hoping it might be.
So I think the general idea of Union Jack flags is okay. But of course, remember that we put a lot of European Union flags on a lot of buildings and a lot of bridges in Britain without that actually changing people's views about the European Union. So it's got to be more than flags. It's got to be a real sense that, and this is one of the things I believe very strongly in the last Scottish referendum, that we campaigned too much on economics and not enough on the fact that we believe in Scotland. I wanted people not just to say Scotland's better off economically. I wanted people to say, we love you, Scotland. Right? My analogy was, if you were going through a divorce, what you don't say to your partner is, you're never going to be able to afford to leave me. If you walk out, you're going to be bankrupt, right? No, you say, I'm so sorry, I love you. What can I do to make this work?
Do you think there is a high chance that Boris Johnson will be the Prime Minister who loses the Union?
Well, that worries me a lot. I think we are in more trouble with the Union than we were a few years ago. I think, and remember, Scotland voted predominantly against Brexit. Boris Johnson is not at all popular in Scotland. And when I was selling the United Kingdom during the last independence referendum, I was selling a relatively centre-ground, moderate David Cameron government that seemed to be reasonably competent, right? So that you could make an argument that the United Kingdom represented stability, good sense, and had been there for a long time. But COVID and Brexit suddenly makes the whole thing seem a bit more rickety. It's more difficult now to say to Scots, here is this very strong, wealthy, thoughtful, sensible thing that you're in. Why would you want to leave it? It begins to seem as though you're in a relationship with a slightly erratic partner.
Okay, well, look, before we get to next year and the year after and whatever else happens in Scotland, we've got to get through Christmas this year. And everyone over here is talking about who they're going to spend Christmas with. Are they going to go home? Are they going to dare go and see Granny and Grandpa? You're in America. What are you going to do? Because presumably you'd have to self-isolate if you came over anyway. How are you going to spend Christmas?
Yeah, so I'm in exactly that situation. So I made the decision not to go back to spend Christmas with my mother for the same reason that other people. And she's not going to thank me for saying how old she is on a podcast. But anyway, she is in the risk category. So
she's 65 plus.
Not be a kindness to go and stay with her. Interestingly, here in the US, though, I'm able to be tested twice a week. So my family have a pretty good idea twice a week of where we are in terms of coronavirus. But for example, with Thanksgiving, my wife not able to have her parents over in the house for Thanksgiving. We saw them briefly outside. And I think, the American experience is not very different from the British experience.
Okay, well, look, Rory, we better finish up this podcast. So just some quick fire questions to end up on. Who do you think has proven themselves a better Prime Minister, Theresa May or Boris Johnson?
I really admire Theresa May. It's a very unfashionable thing to say. I know everybody is now being gloomy about her. I really valued her. I thought she was an honourable person. I thought she was a dignified person. I thought she was a serious person. I was proud to serve in her cabinet, and I was not prepared to serve in a Boris Johnson cabinet.
She's having a bit of a renaissance on the backbenches, actually, Theresa May. She seems to be quite enjoying that position of, she had so much trouble from Boris Johnson, didn't she, over Brexit? Maybe she's enjoying a bit of a revenge now from the backbenches. Where would you go on holiday as Prime Minister, do you think? Because you do like your travel.
I do like my travel. I quite like the Theresa May model. So I like the combination of walking in Wales and walking in Switzerland, but then I'm a bit of a walker.
Well, there's nothing wrong with walking in Wales. I'm very much a fan of walking in Wales as well from myself. What would your Downing Street pet be? Are you an animal fan?
Yeah, I think I'm very much an animal fan. But I try to get a grip on my instincts to get crazy animals. So I definitely, making friends with Larry the cat, I think, is the key. And you'd really have to ask Larry's opinion on whether Larry really wants a dog in the house.
So it would be a dog. If it was going to be anything, you think you'd take a dog in?
Yeah, but I just have to square that with Larry.
That sounds very, very diplomatic. And lastly, would you ever come back and serve again in British politics? Would you ever want another shot at being Prime Minister for real?
Yes, I if I was very lucky, I think it would be the most extraordinary privilege. I think Britain is still one of the most extraordinary countries on earth. I think we can do amazing things. And I would love to play a part, even if I wasn't Prime Minister, even in somebody's cabinet, in trying to rebuild a vision of a more serious, thoughtful country and chart us through what's going to be a very, very difficult half century ahead. I'd be enormously privileged to do that. But I suspect now at this stage of my career, it would be more a question of whether somebody would want me back in their cabinet than my running for Prime Minister.
That's quite an honest answer. I wasn't expecting that. What would the route back be? Maybe the Lords and then work up to cabinet from the Lords? Or would you run again as an MP?
I think I'd have to work out whether somebody took over, for example, from Boris Johnson, who I really got on with and who I believed in and who I could support. And then I'd have to reach out to them and ask whether they wanted my support. And maybe they would be interested in my support on foreign affairs, because that's the kind of thing I know quite a lot about. Or maybe it would just be what I enjoy doing, which is trying to fix government and get things running more seriously. But it would depend on who the leader was.
Okay, well, Rory, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thanks for all your honest answers. I guess that's the benefit of being outside of politics. You can really, really tell me what you think now.
Great relief, Paul. One of the problems in politics is not being able to say what you think, and that stops you thinking. You get stupider in politics as a result.
Well, you can use those brain cells however you like now over in America. So, Rory, thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Paul.